Time. Hello and welcome to the Wednesday, November 14th edition of the Cluster API subproject meeting for SIG Cluster Lifecycle. We have a pretty short agenda today, so if folks want to add more things to the agenda, that would be great. But in the meantime, let's go ahead and dive into our first topic, which is a follow-on from last week, which is talking about basically sharing common provisioning logic in the upstream repo so that provider repos don't have to re-implement it. So it's like I stuck a link to the doc in our meeting notes, and I think, Marco, you linked also to a PR here as well with the proposal. And I think there were some comments that were left right before the meeting, so you said you've responded to most comments, but there are probably a couple of new ones there that we should dive into. So just, can you give us like a quick, 2-minute overview for people that may have missed the last meeting about what you're proposing and why?
Hello, everyone. We have started talking about the common provisioning scripts having in Cluster API, and so far we have wrote a proposal. And what we want to have some common scripts that are usually same between providers, such as installing Kubernetes, kubeadm, and such stuff is mostly same. Even provisioning to some degree is same, but there's some difference. To make it easier for Cluster API implementers to get started, we want to create some mechanism to have scripts available to those who want to use them. So those that are easy to get started, but still everybody can provide their own scripts if that provided one doesn't work for their cloud provider or whatever. And for now, we have a proposal. We have talked about it at the last meeting. And as we discussed it, I have created a PR with the proposal. I also ported comments from Google Docs to GitHub, so it is easy to follow what has been talked about so far. There are some outstanding comments and for this meeting. Some of them are answered, but I think there is some point that we should talk about now if we have time for that.
Great. Before we dive into specific comments, Tim's got his hand up.
So the AWS provider, we talked about this in the very beginning, that we did not want to go this route on purpose because it's less idempotent and there's a bunch of issues that can crop up along the way. So we use image stamping and referencing the canonical images for the versions that we have. We did this on purpose because it can be super thorny from a number of different perspectives, and for exactly the reason that you mentioned, people keep on washing, rinsing, repeating the same type of scripts over and over again across different providers. I don't know if there's an official take on it, but I think from a simplicity of management from your provider perspective and from your API, it actually greatly simplifies what you need to do for that aspect. I don't have strong opinions on making a set of hooks, if you want to call them that, standard or common.
On the AWS side, how do you, so presumably if you're image stamping, you are creating new images for every release that you want to support, for every OS that you want to support? And how do you intend to support CI? For OS, you can stamp whatever you want to. We have the stamper available for people to use. They just need to specify details of the image that they want, whatever image they want, right? So inside of the repo, the AWS repo, there exists a utility for them to create their stamps, and they can provide their configuration of deployment stuff. We just need to make sure that the plumbing to kubeadm is sane. I'll let Chuck and Vince talk in more detail on logistics.
Yes, on the image stamping?
Yep, and how it all plumbs through.
Yeah, so I mean, it's like you said, we make it available and stamp out the images that we use. I think right now we're using CentOS and Ubuntu, and then we bump that for the version of Kubernetes we want to use. But we actually do on the AWS side, we actually do use the cloud or cloud init. Yeah, we use the cloud init script to actually provision the cluster or install the cluster, and then also run the join command.
So which pieces of provisioning are happen in the stamper and the image creation versus via the cloud init scripts?
Yeah, so that's getting the actual Kubernetes binaries onto into the image, and then the script is actually using the binaries.
The script is basically, the cloud init script is basically the join and the details for the token for the join.
Yep. There's several different ones, but it's just Kubernetes commands essentially.
Okay, so that's interesting. That's very similar to the proposal that I put into the doc, which was to separate these sort of two layers of get all the pieces in place and then actually actuate them to create a cluster. And I think if we make a clean separation between those two, I think there are cases where having a script to get everything in place is useful. People don't want to use the image stamping. And if you want to use the image stamping, you can skip that part and just use the sort of actuation path. So I think that actually fits pretty well with what you guys are doing today.
Yeah,
So
having a standard place to put the binaries and things like that.
Okay, we rattled a little bit there. Marco, let's circle back. You said there were a couple of outstanding comments that we should discuss during this meeting. Do you have a list of those that we should work through?
Yes. So far, a quick note about the image stamping that we have talked about now is that I like how it works, and for Amazon, it works great. And it is a great way to skip some of these steps. But an important thing to mention is that for case of some other cloud providers, such, for example, I worked on cluster API provider for DigitalOcean, and they still don't have custom image feature that allows you easily to share image. That may be a problem to go with that approach because building and starting images may be hard. So and I guess that may still apply to some smaller cloud providers. I'm not sure how that works for Google Cloud, but that is the feature that really depends on cloud provider. And I have mentioned it a little bit on the end of the proposal, but for now I think that some basic stuff to at least get Kubernetes in so you don't have to take care of about that may be helpful, because that's mostly the same and just a boilerplate stuff that is boring. But so far about the comments, let me just check something for a moment. I can find the proposal now. Okay, I found it. So what we have the problem is that, as Robert mentioned in the comments on the Google document, is that we have two steps, like one step to get binaries in and second step to actually start Kubernetes, initialize the cluster and all the stuff. I think we can agree that the part when we get binaries in the cluster is easy. For Ubuntu, we can use just apt-get install kubeadm, kubelet, and such stuff. And that is same for all cloud providers. And this is a part that we can definitely get in as is without any changes or any too big changes. But more problem we have is how do we want to handle cluster initialization? Because what we have kubelet configuration, which a lot depends on cloud provider and infrastructure where we are running, and also have kubeadm configuration file and have kubeadm init. Now kubeadm init is just that command with config file passed in, but a problem is how to build that configuration file and how to build kubelet configuration. Now what I had on my mind is, should we stop on the first step and allow to that cluster API implementer can easily provide the kubelet file and kubeadm config file, and the cluster API will run kubeadm for them, or that they can choose not to go with kubeadm or such stuff. and to go like that, or to still have some basic config file that will run kubelet and kubeadm. And this is the first thing I want to talk about today, if that's okay.
So that was many things. Should we break down the topics into a couple of them? I think the first topic of how do you mesh the input of kubeadm and configuration? Because there's two parts. There's like the kubelet configuration, or the overall kubeadm configuration, or the init configuration. So the way kubeadm is specified now is it's broken up into several different configurations for different phases of the life cycle of whether you're initializing or joining the node or joining to a cluster. So right now, it makes a ton of sense for folks to be able to specify the full config as potentially as a provider input, but again, you'd probably have some variables that you'd be reserved, like site or address ranges and stuff, depending upon how you want to do that. Or you might have some template override. This gets into the weird state space of YAML templating that I don't know if there's an answer that isn't fractal. I don't know of a standard solution that we would want to recommend other than basically punting on that idea and saying it's not our problem, and then allowing folks to just submit it and override where necessary makes a bunch more sense than trying to get into the nerd fight apocalypse of templated YAML configurations and how to do that. With regards to the other side, the join configuration, there are parts of the join configuration that need to be specified and flow through, but most of it from the machine side will be stubbed out. Because, well, at least the way we do it, it's stubbed out. If you don't go with image stamping, then it becomes a little bit weird. Because then you're going to have to specify some details, and that also becomes a little bit more difficult to manage. Vince or Chuck, do you have more comments there?
I guess I'm a little curious about the kubelet config process, because kubeadm gives a way to configure the kubelet, but it might be that I don't understand exactly what needs to be set there. But using kubeadm config as an input sounds like a good idea to me.
Okay, so far about the kubelet configuration, and this is what I am unsure about, because as far as I've seen in the Alpha 2 and Alpha 3 versions of the kubeadm configuration files, you can specify a lot of options for kubelet, and I'm not sure is there anything missing, because for example, when I start a cluster on DigitalOcean, I use kubelet configuration file to specify some stuff as the node IP, because I want to enforce to use the private interface, and I had some networking problems with that. And it is mostly config such as set the service domain name and such stuff, which I think can be set via the kubeadm configuration files. But this is what I am unsure about. Do we need kubelet at this point for configuration, or we can just pass everything to kubeadm configuration file?
If there's something missing, we'll happily provide the pass-through. Vince, you want to say something?
Yeah, I linked to the node configuration that we use. So for example, we do pass the node registration name as the host name here, for the user data, and it does have kubelet extra arguments. So this is what Chuck was pointing to. You can pass all the arguments as this list here. And that's have been working fine. So this is a Go template. We can discuss if this is the best solution or not, but this has been working fine for us.
Okay, that's important to hear, because I was not sure is it working correctly? And it is nice to see that this got improved, that it is actually possible to configure most of kubelet options with kubeadm. In that case, if we have covered most of options, then maybe we don't even need the kubelet configuration file, because I think it's mostly used for some basic options like that, setting up such stuff. That will be definitely one step. We will have one step less. So if we can go without that, I think that will help a lot.
I have a question about kubeadm. So I'm looking at the configuration type. Does it end up generating kubelet config in the end, or does it pass all these like directly as like flags? Like how does it get this information to the kubelet and elsewhere?
There's two parts to the kubelet configuration. Are you talking about how it's done in the AWS provider, or just generic kubeadm question?
Yeah, I was just wondering if this ended up turning into a kubelet config file.
The args flow to eventually become a kubelet config file on disk that gets specified and run on startup. So like the args feed through, and there's two parts to the args. There's cluster-wide settings that get ripped down from kubeadm config, as well as local information about the kubelet, such as the CRI, that then gets overridden and written to local disk. This has evolved over a long time.
Okay, thanks.
Just one clarification on that. I don't think it's quite a kubelet configuration file. It's an environment file that defines all the flags that are specified.
That is true. Yep.
Yep.
So we're not using component config for the kubelet.
We do not. We use a portion of kubelet configuration, and then we use an env value bar override. So we don't do full component configuration with the full dynamic component configuration, but we do use component configuration. So it's not dynamic. We pull it down, and we set it for. It's pretty much heterogeneous for your environment.
Right, I think the clarification was, it sounded like Chuck was saying, we have a file that generates a bunch of flags versus passing the kubelet one flag that says, here's your config file in like the YAML format that Topham defined.
Yeah, because you can't. You can't do full dynamic. There's a bunch of issues.
But it's not dynamic, right? Like there are two parts of that. You can do static kubelet configuration using the same config language that you would use for dynamic, but not have it be dynamic, right?
Yes, there's local overrides for env files as well as a component configuration file. So it's a mux of both.
Okay. All right, so Tim or Marco, do you feel like we're getting any closer to actually answering the first question, which was how to mesh input for kubeadmin from a common sort of node bootstrapping script?
Not sure. So is there anything preferred by you or anybody else on the meeting on how would you like to see this handled?
I think I need to read the original proposal and go back and try and understand it. I've been too busy on 113 from trying to get the release out because we are tightly bound to the release cycle, and we're switching kubeadm to BGA this cycle. So it's been pretty difficult to keep track. So I might circle back to that, but there's no guarantees I'll even have bandwidth to do that.
Tim, can I ask, does moving kubeadm to GA mean that the API types are also moving to GA?
The configuration file, which is the types for kubeadm, is going to v1 beta 1. But all the command line args and everything else are going to GA. We're super conservative and always have been with how we do promotion in kubeadm because a lot of folks depend upon it. So we don't want to break any compatibility. But for some of the alpha commands and the alpha phases, we've switched. We've promoted those things that are common to be first-class citizens underneath a NIT as separate phases. And then the configuration is now v1 beta 1, and we've trimmed down a lot of superfluous stuff that people have wanted to add and have plumbing and plans for how you pass configuration for all the different components in.
Thanks.
Okay, so far, I don't have any personal questions on this first question. I think the only open action item for me is to see how about the kubeadm configuration and node configuration. Also, we have to see about how do we want to provide that kubeadm configuration file. And a little related to next question is how do we want to store it? Do we want to place it to let user provide it from zero and don't have any kubeadm configuration file in those scripts and then just execute it with kubeadm in it? And this is what we have. Is there any preference on that topic on how do we want to store that file?
I'll defer to Chuck and Vince.
We store it like we create it like in a temporary file and like it just store it and give it to kubeadm init or join. It's if you look at the link, it's just there and then it just goes away because it's a temporary file in a attempted directory. But right now we don't give the option to change this file yet. So that's something that we might have to think about.
The file is stored on cluster, by the way. So as you do you're on your first init, it is stored as a config map. So for future kubeadm commands can reference it. That's been part of the lifecycle for a while.
I think it's okay for AWS, but the question here is that this file may be a bit different between cloud providers. So does it make sense even to template it or just to say users to provide it like we provide provider components and such stuff?
I think again, this gets really fractal with regards to this stuff. I think having some global, like, you can consider it almost like a set of lifecycle things where it'd be like, give me the defaults for your provider, right? And then you have a set of overrides, right, that you can do. I think you could probably batch the configuration modifications into a set of lifecycle events. And like step one is get same defaults for provider X, and that gives you like a fully fleshed out kubeadm config for a given provider, which has, it's all stubbed out. And then a user can modify it and then ingest as part of the provider config all the way through. I wouldn't necessarily do the templating inside of the API itself. I'd do it as like a utility function that exists possibly for all providers.
Okay, that makes sense. That sounds good.
Yeah, the other question I have is if I look at the file that Vince linked to and the corresponding one for the control plane, I mean, those files are really short, including all comments. Like the node file that AWS guys have written is 70 lines long, and the control plane one is 75 lines long. And how much do we want to optimize and write a whole bunch of code and templating to try and share that logic, right? If I compare that with the scripts that we use, for GCP, where we actually do all the OS installation pieces, those scripts are long and complex because we are trying to install a bunch of things somewhat reliably on the OS. The actual scripts that AWS folks have written, where they are using pre-stamped images, which have everything already installed, are very short and sweet and provider specific. So if we could share all of the logic where if you don't have the pre-stamped images, get an image up to be the point where it's ready to be joined to the cluster, I think that's a pretty big value, and we've agreed that those things are pretty common across providers. And then if we keep these 150 lines of code and we have to duplicate that a few times, because they're all different, and that gets rid of a bunch of templating and sort of ugly interfaces between the different layers of the stack, I don't see that as being a bad thing.
Yeah, that's basically what our image stamper does, and it's just Ansible based. So like, you know, use Ansible for what it's good for. Don't try to deploy a cluster, but use it for idempotent image creation, and that it works really well for that. And it basically there's enough parameters there to do what we need to do, and we'd be happy to push that to some other common location for people to use and reference.
Tim, another question about the image stamper. Like, we thought about like licenses. Do you have to worry about the licenses of the OS when you're stamping out the image?
Not if they're open source licenses. We only stamp currently for what's it called? For CentOS and Ubuntu. If you are worrying about other examples, you can basically pass that, you know, information into Cloud Init 2 as well, and your Cloud Init script would be a little more complicated, but most of your other stuff would not be. So like if you were doing traditional RHEL type of things, you would have your registry information for how you're going to certify your distro, you know, as part of the init script for on startup. But everything else would be stamped out, and you could use a common set of tools for that. They have base cloud images that you can reference, and then from those base cloud images, you can actually stamp everything else out.
Thanks.
Do we want to proceed with the questions, or?
Yeah, let's move on to the next question. We have 30 more minutes, and I feel like we could spend the whole rest of the time on this one. So let's make sure we at least do a broad pass across all of them. We can come back if there's time at the end. So what were the other? I know there was at least one thing on my mind that was another outstanding question, but I want to know what else is on your list, Marco. That was still need to be discussed in the meeting.
Okay. I think most of questions are answered, but another big problem we have with this proposal is how do we want to store scripts in our code, or how we want to do that. You mentioned using bundles, but do we want to do something like that, and how that would look like? And do we want to use templating and just our Go templates? What would be preferred?
Yes, this was the other thing I definitely wanted to discuss. So I'm pretty leery of using Go templates. I think there was, we initially did that for the GCP implementation and switched over to using config maps, because if you use Go templates, you actually have to recompile and repush binaries when you want to fix your script, which is really annoying. And we found that, especially even for things like development velocity, once you get your cluster up, if you can tweak your config map until things are working, and then you can use that config map from the get-go next time, that's really convenient. One downside of using config maps is that they're basically just an untyped data blob. So the logical next step after config maps is to look at using something like the CRD, where you actually have better type information in there. And the reason I mentioned the bundle is because the bundle effectively already has a sort of proto CRD for this use case. I don't think it's necessarily had a lot of eyes on it yet, but I think Josh dropped a link to it this morning in the doc that's not been reflected in the PR. But there's a part of the bundle that basically is the node configuration, which has a place to stick, initialization scripts, which, would basically be a place where we could say, in the code, you get passed in this Kubernetes object, right? It could be the bundle CRD or a similar CRD. And the code says, great, here are the init scripts, let me run those scripts. And we can then, take the common init scripts and then the sort of specialization for cluster formation, put those two things together and pass that to the actuator code. is sort of how I was picturing it. I think avoiding Go templates would be really nice, just because I don't want to have to build new binaries if we want to tweak a template. It also, I think, gives the providers more flexibility too, right? Because you don't have to re-vendor new code. You don't have to try to push a change upstream, when you want to tweak a template, right?
Okay, that makes a lot of sense because Go templates are built in and maybe we want to run away from that so it is easier to maintain everything. So I will take a look in bundles. I'm still not sure how that will look like, but as you said, maybe there is a link somewhere in the proposal. So I will try to find a little bit more about that and maybe update proposal and comment on that.
I put a link down in the alternatives considered section.
Okay, good. I see it. Thanks.
Yeah, so I think one of the things Josh and I talked about this morning is we've been talking with the KubeADM folks about possibly having them adopt parts of the bundle as well, because it's a pretty generic sort of schema for how to define what should be run in your cluster. This specific part of the bundle, the node configuration part, is I think a part that the KubeADM project itself probably doesn't care about, because they don't care about how the node is configured, right? They expect a person to do that out of band and then someone to run KubeADM join. And it leads to higher level tooling like the cluster API to configure nodes to be in a ready state. And this node config is basically a way for us to codify what the cluster API would need to do to get the nodes ready for KubeADM to join. There are other parts of the bundle specification that talk about like how the control plane should be configured, which different binaries should be run, and so forth. And I think that part is less relevant to this discussion, but might be relevant to what you mentioned previously about how we pass data down from the cluster API into KubeADM. Because if we adopted a similar way of describing different parts of the system, then I think it would be easier to pass the data back and forth, and we would have less sort of templating and Go templates or whatever else that we need to pass between the different layers of the stack.
Okay. I think it sounds good. I will look into all this stuff because this topic is still a very important one, but not really explained in the proposal besides using Go templates. So before proceeding with this proposal, I will take a look into that and try to provide as much as detail as possible and to find an alternative way beside Go templates, because indeed, maybe that's not the best way to handle all this. I hope that sounds okay, and I hope that should work if you find something to replace them.
Right, and I think the other thing to keep in mind is that if the bundle definition right now isn't quite what we want, it's not set in stone. Like we put it out there as here's what we think it might look like, but this would be a really great sort of concrete use case to validate whether that approach is correct, and if not, what should be fixed about it. And so, I guess the main thing I would propose is we actually use a Kubernetes type for this. And I think, the bundle could adopt that type if it's not the type that's currently in the bundle, right? If that makes sense, right? Like, yes. I'd love for those things to come together. And I know that the KubeADM folks have started looking at the bundle. I don't know how far they've gotten. And I know that Justin has been really excited about trying to apply the bundle into COPS as well. And so, again, from a consistency point of view, as we're trying to drive sort of consistency across different pieces of the cluster lifecycle stack, if we can start finding things like that about here's consistent ways to describe how we configure things, that becomes a powerful tool that we can take to people that are, like KubeSpray and COPS and so forth, and try to start pushing some consistency across the ecosystem.
I would love to, in the 114 cycle, to start to view add-ons from a bundle perspective. I think that would be, after we push out GA and we've done a lot of our other cleanup work that we need to do, that would be beneficial for us, and I think everybody, just to view core add-ons as a bundle. Right now, the management of it is very fractal, and in fact, it's almost unsustainable. So I don't like blocking PRs. I don't like doing all these other things. But unless we actually have a single canonical location for how we manage this stuff, it doesn't do any of our users or customers any good at all.
Right. Yeah, I think that's having some consistency on how we, configure control planes and how we, configure nodes and how we, eventually configure machines and clusters and add-ons, all these different pieces. I think it's part of the value that the cluster lifecycle SIG can bring to the community, because if we can start driving consistency across the tools that are part of our SIG, and potentially even into some of the commercial tools as well, then that creates a more sort of seamless and consistent user experience, right? Which I think is part of our goal. So anyway, Marco, I would love for you to take a look at the bundle, see how that would fit with your notion of how you might want to break up the Bootstrap script and make sort of a consistent version that we can use in multiple places.
Okay, will do.
Thanks.
So I think beside that, I don't have any questions, and we used a lot of time on this meeting for this. So if you have any other questions, feedback, and anything like that, you can leave a comment on Google document or on PR, and we will try to get back as soon as possible to see and to answer the comments. I will also try to take a look at everything we talked about today and to update the proposal if needed, or to give some update.
Cool. And I just want to make sure that somebody thanks you for doing this. This is great that you're trying to drive consistency here, because I think having a place, and maybe we should also look at converging with the image stamper, but having a place where we can sort of consolidate on these bootstrapping scripts, the fewer of them that we have to maintain, the more reliable we can make them, the better tested they will be, et cetera. Like, I think that is a great goal to have in mind. So thank you for bringing that up and for driving this as well.
No problem. I'm happy to do this.
I know you mentioned you took up a lot of time, but there wasn't actually anything else on the agenda after this. So does anyone else have anything they want to discuss, or should we end our meeting a few minutes early?
Robert, just one quick thing. Can you just add like a link to the bundle thing in the doc so that it's easier to find?
Yes. So there's a link at the bottom of the Google Doc linked from the notes, but I will stick a link directly into the notes as well. I put it into chat, but I feel like the meeting's about to end, so it's probably not worth putting in there. Or I'll drop it in the chat real quick for you too, since I already have it. There you go.
Thanks.
All right, any other agenda items before we disperse? All right, thanks everyone. I'll let you know, I have been going through PRs and trying to get things merged. It's always easier if someone has already LGTM them. So if you find people to review your PRs and give them a first pass, that's super helpful. And otherwise, I'm doing my best to keep up with them. We've merged a number in the last couple of days. And I see people are still sending more this morning. So thanks for those also. It's great to see people stepping up and fixing things. All right. And with that, we'll call it for the week. Thanks everyone for coming, and we'll see you guys again next week.
Bye,
Take
everyone.
care.